Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you for Reason to Resist on July 7th, 2025 from Montreal, Canada. This past July 5th was the day on which Algeria and its people commemorated the 63rd anniversary of regaining sovereignty after 132 years of colonization. The day passed, however, with barely a whisper from the Western corporate media, not unusual in these parts, but Algeria's Independence Day has a special resonance for what is happening in the Arab world today. Reason to Resist therefore invited Hamza Hamouchene to speak with us about the meaning of this day and its relevance to the wars of aggression that Western states and their Israeli proxy are now waging upon Arabs and Muslims. Hamza is a London-based Algerian researcher, activist, commentator, and a founding member of Algeria Solidarity Campaign. He's also the author or editor of several books, including The Arab Uprisings, A Decade of Struggles, published in 2022, and he joins us today from London, England. Thank you so much for joining us, Hamza.
Thank you, Dimitri, for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Hamza, I'd like to begin by talking to you about Algeria's War of Independence. And I'm going to assume for purposes of our discussion that most people who are listening to it don't know a great deal about it. It certainly was something that I only began to appreciate and understand quite later in life. So I'd like to start with some basic facts. When did it happen? How many Algerians died in the War of Independence? And in your opinion, what finally brought the colonial power to its knees in that struggle?
I think there are already three questions there. I think it's important to start by saying that the Algerian War of Independence is one of the most inspiring anti-colonial struggles in the 20th century, alongside Vietnam and other struggles in various parts of the world. And it is one important, or let's say significant, historical chapter of anti-colonial history that came in the time of the awakening of the South, the time of the Bandung Conference, the time of the Third Wordism. And Algeria played an important role in that, especially the Algerian struggle against French colonialism. So Algeria has been a settler colony, which is a unique thing in the Arab region and in the African continent for 132 years. So a length of time and depth that is truly unique in the region. And a settler colony in all its violent manifestations, violent, barbaric, cruel manifestations of trying to eliminate the natives, dispossess them from their land and resources, impoverish them and proletarianize them, consider them as second-class citizens, and destroy their local economies, the subsistence agriculture. And that lasted, as I said, for 132 years, from 1830, even before the Berlin Conference, where the European empires and colonial powers have gathered in Berlin in order to scramble or to divide Africa. So Algeria was actually colonized 50 years, more than a half century before that conference. I think that conference took place around 1881, if I'm not mistaken, if that's the correct date. But Algerians resisted, the colonial encroachment, the scorched earth policies of colonialism, its attempt to eradicate the local people for decades, since day one. Of course, rebellions and revolts get crushed violently, and a lot of people paid the price with their lives and with their livelihoods and with their property. Like some estimates, just in the 4 decades when France invaded Algeria in 1830, just the 4 decades of resistance, especially it was a rural agrarian resistance by the peasantry, because the Algerian society at the time was peasant-based, agriculture, which is subsistence agriculture based. So the peasantry resisted. So they were not passive victims, resisted for decades in various ways the colonial enterprise, the French colonial enterprise. Just in those 4 decades, millions of people perished. from famine, from massacres, from diseases, and other factors. But Algerian resistance continued in different ways, and then it got reinvigorated in early 20th century into a modern Algerian nationalism that tried political means, electoral means, integrationist means, but failed. And finally, the Algerian nationalists realized that armed struggle is the only way forward against, a colonially violent empire that wanted to cling to its colony, Algeria, and they launched the Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 1962. So 8 years of brutal fighting, of massacres, of huge displacement. The estimations of the losses amount to around 1.5 million. These are the official estimates. 1.5 million of people perished in those 8 years, plus millions of people displaced, hundreds of thousands in concentration camps, hundreds of thousands of hectares burned with napalm, thousands of villages destroyed. So you can imagine the amount of suffering and sacrifice that the Algerians paid to win their independence from the French. I think it's a long answer to your three questions, but yeah, I'm happy to follow up if I missed something, Dimitri.
Well, you summarized it brilliantly. I think that is a very long and complex and painful history that I think you've done a wonderful job of giving us an overview of. And the one aspect of my question, which I apologize for having put to you three questions in one, but the latter part was ultimately, what do you think brought the colonial power to its knees in this epic struggle?
I think it's not easy to answer that question briefly, but I'll try to give a few elements or a few reflections on the reasons that brought the empire down, as you say. First of all, we need to situate the Algerian struggle, as I said, in that long wave of the South awakening, of the anti-colonial struggles that go back to the Chinese Revolution, the Vietnamese Revolution, also the Cuban Revolution, other African revolutions. So we need to place it in that context at the time of the rise of the South and the challenge to the imperialist order, especially to the colonial order at the time. So Algeria came in that context. So that context helped the Algerians. And if we want to have a direct link to that context, we just need to read or listen to what the Algerian nationalist militants or the Algerian militants in the Front de Libération Nationale, the the National Liberation Front, who led the revolution, by connecting actually their uprising to that anti-colonial wave and actually connecting it directly to the French defeat in Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam, where the Vietnamese forces, Ho Chi Minh's forces, inflicted a humiliating defeat for the French Empire. And that was 7th of May, 1954. And actually, the significance of that moment cannot be orchestrated, cannot be exaggerated, because it has been a significant moment, because the oppressed and colonized people saw that the empire is not that invincible. So that moment, the Dien Bien Phu moment, shattered the myth of the invincibility of the French Empire and convinced other colonized people that the only way forward is armed struggle. They got emboldened by that moment, and the same thing happened with them, with the Algerians. So I think that context also of third worldism, anti-colonial movements, it needs to be brought to the discussion, especially when we talk about Palestine today, because that context is not there anymore. The context, at least the political, diplomatic context of transnational solidarity, South-South solidarity, solidarity between the oppressed, between colonized, was so strong in the 50s and 60s. And that context definitely helped the Algerian nationalist and anti-colonial struggle. That's one moment. That's one thing. Second thing is the sacrifices of the Algerian nationalists and the Algerian pro-independence movement and the people behind them, because they managed to mobilize the people behind that pro-independence project. They managed to convince them that the only way forward is armed struggle against the French, because all the other non-violent means have been tried. And the FLN, which is the National Liberation Front, managed also to rally all the political forces under its banner. Perhaps some people would argue that this has been done in an authoritarian and coercive way, but they managed to unify the Algerian force behind that project. But I think it's really important, Dimitri, to say something here, that the Algerians did not win the war militarily. I think it's really important to say it again and again and again, because the Algerian nationalists, as the Vietnamese, when they were fighting the French and the Americans, as well as the other colonized people, their leadership had a realistic assessment of the balance forces on the ground. You were fighting big, advanced, militarily equipped imperialist and colonial forces. At the time, France, I think, was number 4 in terms of being an advanced military force in the world. And it was backed by NATO. Let's not forget that. So the Algerians knew that you cannot beat that force or that power militarily, but you use armed struggle within a broader political vision. You use armed struggle to advance your political objectives. So you have a kind of a political strategy, and you realize that that's the only way forward is to use various tactics, including armed struggle, but this has been subordinated into a political strategy. And actually, in the Algerian Revolution, that has been strengthened and emphasized, especially starting from 1956 after the Soumam gathering. So there was a gathering, a political gathering in the Soumam Valley, where various political and military leaders of the Algerian Revolutionary met to discuss specifically these points, saying the political before the military, and the interior before the exterior. So there are priorities of the revolution that we need to start with, and all the other priorities need to be subordinated to that larger political strategy. So, and Abban Ramdan was one of the architects of, this political strategy of bringing all the political forces behind this program, this revolutionary program of action. And it was him who decided to take revolutionary violence or armed struggle to the urban areas, because it has been confined in the first phase of the revolution, especially the first 2 to 3 years, to the rural areas, to the mountains. Guerrilla war and tactics were mainly in the mountains and rural areas. But then they saw that it was really important to situate the Algerian struggle at the level of the international discussions, at the level of the UN, and push it diplomatically. So they thought we need to take the armed struggle and revolutionary violence into the urban areas. And that's when they launched the Battle of Algiers. So maybe your listeners know a little bit about the Battle of Algiers, because that's a title of an amazing realist film by Gillo Pontecorvo that depicted the main events of that urban warfare and how it has been dismantled also by the French through systematic torture and bombing and killing and assassinations and so forth. So the Algerian won politically. These were the decisive political and diplomatic battles, because they ended up isolating the French and delegitimizing the rule and order at the international level. So it's really important to put that point, maybe when we're going to discuss about Palestine a little bit later. So these are the elements. Of course, the abnegation and sacrifices of a lot of people, that it's true sacrifice and true suffering that ended up weakening, the French Empire and forcing it out.
Mm-hmm. It's when you talked about the solidarity in the global South and amongst anti-colonial revolutionaries at the time. It reminds me of one of my most loved documentaries, Alger, la Mecque des révolutionnaires, which translates into Algiers, the Mecca of revolutionaries, and it depicts the first 2 years. I believe the name of the first president after the War of Independence was Ben Bella, and it depicts this extraordinary milieu that Alger became, where it attracted Che Guevara and Nelson Mandela and the Black Panthers and Yasser Arafat. They all converged in Alger. And then somehow, after Ben Bella was removed from power, it seemed as though that spirit was not necessarily lost, but diminished. And over time, Algeria has, it seems to me as an outsider, who does have family members who are Algerian on my wife's side, as though the country has struggled to truly free itself from the grip of Western colonialism. And today, in fact, last few months, I understand it, the Algerian government has been gripped in a rather difficult relationship with France, and there's a lot of tension there. So first of all, could you comment on whether you believe the promise of the revolution has been realized in Algeria, or do you think that the anti-colonial struggle in your country has a long way to go?
That's a very good question, Dimitri. Like the way you characterized it, just like after 3 years, I think that spirit was lost. I think it's much more complex than that. And I think if different perspectives can be brought to the table depending on where you stand ideologically, and depending if you're nihilistic or not, because nothing is perfect. Even if I talk about the Algerian Revolution in very positive terms, I know a lot of its shortcomings, limitations, negative sides. Revolutions are messy business. And tell me if you know a perfect revolution. I'm happy. I'm happy to hear about it. But that doesn't mean that we ignore those negative sides. Not at all. I'm not justifying that. In the contrary, we need to learn the history. We need to learn the lessons. What happened? How can we do revolution better? How can we make revolutions really sustainable in a context, in a very hostile context? Let's not forget that those revolutions or those revolutionary forces operate in deeply hostile context, especially from imperialists and other reactionary forces, either local or outside. So sometimes you make big mistakes, huge mistakes. It does not justify them, but I'm just talking about the context. So the way I see revolutions, Dimitri, I see them as long-term processes. So they're not just one event in time that succeeds or gets defeated. Of course, there are some victories in then and after, but I see them as long term. So for me, the struggle for Algerians for popular sovereignty, for democratizations, is still ongoing. And I'm not talking about, bourgeois liberal elections in the sense of what we have in the West. I'm talking about true democratization, popular decision making on your economic systems, having a say about how your land and resources are being used, for what purpose, who owns what, who gets what. So these are the questions of democratization, real democratization that I'm talking about. We're not there yet. Similar to many countries, including the West. So for people to not say, Hamza is saying that, the West is democracy. I don't believe that the West are democracies. If if that's the democracies that we are talking about, I don't think that's the model that we need to promote in other parts of the world. We need true democratizations. Power, democracy means power to the people, right? Not power to capital, to corporations, to the bourgeoisie, to corporate media who get to dictate to us what we should consume, how we should think, what kind of economic systems we do. That's not democracy. So in that sense, the struggle of Algerians for true emancipation is still ongoing, as the struggle of other oppressed people all over the world still continues. But then, do you want to jump in here, Dimitri?
I did, yeah. Before we move to the subject of Palestine, I want to ask you about how Algeria today is. And by the way, you'll get no argument from me about the lack of democracy in the West. I don't believe any Western country was ever a true democracy. But I think in my lifetime, Western countries are less democratic now than they have ever been. There have been elements of democracy, vestiges of democracy in Western countries, as in many other countries around the world. But real democracy, full-blown democracy, no, we've never come close, in my opinion. So, and this is something we talk about a lot on our program. But I want to just talk about sort of this Algeria, such as it is today, its relationship to the colonial powers. Wesley Clark, the former NATO commander, back in 2003, revealed that the Bush administration had plans to basically destroy the governments of 7 countries in the Arab and Muslim world. And they were Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Iran, Somalia, and Sudan. Since then, all of them have been attacked repeatedly. Several of them have been destroyed. With the ouster of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, one might argue that the last Arab nationalist government standing is that of Algeria. I don't know. I'm curious to know whether you view it that way. And are you concerned? Do you see signs? I mentioned, a moment ago that there are these tensions between France, the French government of Macron. Yeah. Are you worried that Algeria might be next? That they're going to try to install some kind of a puppet regime, inevitably, if they succeed in their current nefarious project in West Asia?
Yeah, when you see all these imperialist interventions with all the Zionist machinations in our region, of course you will be scared. Of course I'm scared about for Algeria. I am. There is instability all around us. Libya, it's chaos after the NATO intervention there. We have also in the south, like Mali and Niger, huge instability in the Sahel there. Morocco, they brought us the Zionist entity to our borders after normalizing, and they are doing military surveillance deals with them. Tunisia is politically unstable. Like as the Algerian regime, I'm a dissident, by the way. Like I oppose the Algerian regimes in terms of the democratization agenda, and I, to be honest, I'm disappointed because I feel that Algeria could be playing a much more better role diplomatically and politically in the region, could have constituted a kind of an alliance of resistance against imperialism. I feel it's not doing that enough for various reasons, and I think some of it has to do with the leadership that is ruling Algeria right now. I feel it's somehow schizophrenic, sometimes comprador, sometimes nationalist. At the economic level, they are selling off the country. Let's just say it. And this is clear. You look at the project that they are putting on the mining law. They want to sell all our resources to the highest bidder. So there is kind of schizophrenia there. But of course, Algeria is much better than other countries in the region, huh? Don't get me wrong. If you compare it with Morocco, if you compare it with Egypt, with Jordan, Algeria's political positions, at least when it comes to decolonization struggles in Western Sahara, in Palestine, is honorable. I just wish they could have done more, but they haven't. Algeria is one of the biggest, producers of gas, exporters of gas to the European Union. At no point they threatened to cut those supplies. And this is in a context of genocide. an ongoing genocide. So, okay, you're doing some diplomatic work at the level of the UN, you're doing some, nice speeches and nice declarations there, but that's not enough. But I want to come back a little bit to your questions so the listener can understand what is happening here. Um, just I'm gonna give like a brief account of the last, let's say, 50 to 60 years. In the first 15 to 20 years after independence, Algeria engaged in a strong delinking experience. Delinking means from the imperialist capitalist system, trying to build a sovereign economy, industrialized quite fast. It was a quite ambitious political and economic project with very progressive elements and characteristics in it. Of course, there are problems. It was too centralized, top bottom, authoritarian, not giving enough space to workers and peasants. We can all have those, criticisms. But that delinking experience was an important, inspiring project. That made Algeria, alongside Egypt and South Africa, just in 15 years, one of the most industrialized economies on the African continent. Let's not negate all of that and say all of it was bad. The Algerian nationalists just betrayed everything. No, it's much more complex, because if you have a class analysis, that project, that delinking project that really wanted to create an economy for the people, self-centered, starting with the priorities, building huge industries, doing an agrarian reform that failed, unfortunately, but that was the thinking. We need to distribute land to the peasants and so forth. That project had its enemies, class enemies, the nascent or the growing bourgeoisie, reactionary bourgeoisie that resisted the redistribution of land, that did not want a heavily planned economy, that wanted foreign direct investment to connect with the Western Bloc even more. So those elements started to get ascendancy in the 80s, because that project, the Delinkin project, ran out of steam and showed a lot of political contradictions, also other lethal contradictions, because it was dependent on foreign currency and dependent on debts. These are the legacy of colonialism that destroyed the Algerian economy. And when the European settlers left, they took all the money. There was no money. Just imagine, just in 15 years, what the Algerian leaders and the Algerian workers achieved. And then starting from the 80s with the global neoliberal counter-revolution, that project started being undermined internally and externally. So by the 90s, we started having structural adjustment programs, experiences like so many countries in the global south, undermining the whole experience, saying it's a failure, we shouldn't do that, we should go to a market-based economy. And actually, Algeria...
I want to clarify, when you say structural adjustment programs, I assume you're referring to the austerity regimes, which are embellished with this language, usually prescribed by the International Monetary Fund. Is that what you're referring to?
Exactly.
Right. Sorry. Please proceed. Yeah, go ahead.
Because we had 2 doses of those programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund, which means they don't want state or public involvement in the economy. They don't want public investment in the economy. So everything is for the private, austerity measures, and then a lot of joblessness, a huge unemployment that took place in the late 90s. And actually, that happened at a time of a civil war between the Algerian military regime and the Islamists. So it was a kind of disaster capitalism, taking the moment when there is a civil war to push for these economic warfare, I would say, economic violence, and impose it on the Algerians. And then by early 2000s, Bouteflika comes in, and under him, for the following, that's almost 20 years, he stayed into power till 2019, when he was overthrown by a democratic popular movement, an inspiring popular democratic movement that that inspired everybody, including myself. I participated in it. A lot of us went back to Algeria many times to participate in those protests. During Bouteflika, the Bouteflika era was the most ultra-liberal era in Algerian history. So it was one of the most ultra-liberal, not one of the most ultra-liberal era of Algerian history. Openness to foreign capital, subsidies and facilitation for many corporations to come and participate in the Algerian economy. And there were even attempts to change some strategic and nationalist laws in terms of ownership of oil and gas fields. But that has been defeated at the time. So this is a little bit just to give the listener what happened in Algeria. So there was really attempts at building national sovereignty at the economic and political level, but it came with contradictions. Of course, it was highly centralized, authoritarian, but then it had its enemies, local enemies and outside enemies that overturned that experience. And that happened in many countries in Algeria, in the global south. So I think it's important to say these things before going to answer your question about Algeria today. And this is of course, my personal assessment. As I said, the Algerian ruling classes right now, they are authoritarian. It is a military dictatorship, unfortunately. Highly comprador, which means selling off the economy, very neoliberal. And there are many examples that I can give. And I gave the example of the mining code, the mining law that they are trying to pass, which is really anti-national, setting off the economy. But then there are signs that the Algerian ruling classes are really nervous about what is taking place in the region. And they are sometimes reacting in very contradictory terms. So, like we can say, in the last few months, they signed an agreement with Africom. I don't know what does that mean, to be honest. They signed another agreement with Chevron, the US company, to explore for gas in the Mediterranean.
And just for our audiences, I'm sorry, AFRICOM is the African Command of the United States military, right?
Yeah.
Yep, sorry.
Yeah.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
And then there was a really controversial statement by the President Tebboune. He did an interview with a French newspaper. I forgot its name. And they asked him specifically about Palestine and Israel. And he said that Algeria is ready to normalize its relations with Israel once there is a Palestinian state. I think that's deeply problematic. Even if it is the position of the Arab League in general, if you recognize the state of Palestine, we can normalize with Israel. By coming from the Algerian government at this time of genocide, that's just unacceptable, to be honest. You don't say those things. No. So, as I said, Algeria could have done much more. And there is a weakness. A weakness is, if you're not a popular government, if you're oppressing your own people, you have an internal weakness. That can be used by the imperialists, by the way. That's why they use all the time. We're gonna come to your countries, destroy your countries to instill democracy. That's why they say, right? Democracy by the bullet. So yeah, we need to really to put that question of democratization at the heart, because most of the regimes in the Arab regions are authoritarian. They do not allow their people even to protest in support of Palestine. They do not allow that in Algeria, by the way. They allowed it once at the start, and when the Algerians started using slogans of the popular movement of 2019 against the military dictatorship, they said no. And actually, the same scenario happened in Egypt, by the way. They allowed for the first protest, and when the protesters started using slogans of the Arab Uprisings, they told them, no, that won't happen.
Right, right. One of the reasons, there are basically two reasons why I very much wanted to have this discussion with you, Hamza. One is because I think, in and of itself, the story of the Algerian struggle for independence is one that must be told. It's an extraordinary story and one about which so little is said in the West. But the other is, I think, that it provides valuable lessons and sometimes painful lessons for the struggle of the Palestinian people. And so, for example, I think the Algerian struggle for independence shows that the price of freedom can be extremely high. We look at the casualties today in Gaza, and as horrifying as they are, for the time being at least, the Palestinians have not suffered millions of dead. But in the case of Algeria, it was indeed that high. The other painful lesson from the Algerian struggle, it seems to me, is the amount of time it took for the Algerian people to achieve independence. And even then, of course, as you've discussed so eloquently, perfect freedom has not yet been achieved. And so the struggle has continued, more than 60 years later from the overthrow of the colonial regime. You talked about it earlier, how at the time of Algeria's independence, there was this tremendous solidarity in the global South, anti-colonial movements coming together and so forth. And today is different. I completely concur with that. The Palestinians confront a different social and economic and political milieu than existed in the 1960s, which perhaps makes it more difficult for them. But on the other hand, one might argue that the struggle is more likely to succeed in their case because the hegemon, the United States, is in rapid decline. How do you see it as an Algerian who's so intimately familiar with the struggle of your own people to achieve independence? How do you view their struggle today and the challenges they confront that the Algerian people didn't confront, and the advantages perhaps that they have that the Algerian people didn't have? Or do you see it essentially as the same struggle?
I think this is a very important conversation that need to take place, and of course, I won't have all the elements in terms of parallels and differences, but I think it's important to share. So I'm gonna say a few things, and then if I remember others, I will jump in again. So in the Arab region, you could say that Palestine and Algeria are considered to be sisters in struggle. As I said, Algeria, I think apart from Algeria and Palestine in the Arab region, nobody had a similar horrific, genocidal, deeply racist settler colonial experience. Unique in terms of length and depth. It's true that Algeria suffered for 132 years. The Palestinians are suffering for more than 7 decades. If we count, British colonialism, I think it's more than a century. So in that sense, there is a natural proximity, or let's say closeness, in terms of struggle. And actually, Algerians see Palestinians, see their efforts, revolutionary efforts, and their decolonization attempts mirroring their own. And the Palestinians see their brothers and sisters as models to follow. And actually, it was the Palestinian revolution that started in 1965 was modeled on the Algerian armed struggle, looking at how to have a rallying political strategy, creating a unified bloc. That's why they created the Palestine Liberation Organization, and using various tactics from the diplomatic, the political, to armed struggle. So Palestinians have been inspired by the Algerian, but they have been inspired by other struggles as well, like the Vietnamese and so forth. So it's really important to say this. Then, in terms of the similarities, I would start with similarities and then I'll come to the differences, Dimitri, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And if you feel that I'm talking too much, please interrupt. It's fine.
No, please take your time. Please take your
time. I've written an essay last year, specifically November, on actually the connections between Algeria, Vietnam, and Palestine. And actually, I called it Vietnam, Algeria, Palestine passing on the torch of revolution or anti-colonial revolution. I forgot the title. It is on the Transnational Institute website. It's available in various languages. And the idea for me was to try to situate the Palestinian struggle in that long wave of anti-colonial struggles and efforts that go back to the Haitian, uprising against French colonialism. Because I felt, at least in, let's say, the European or Northern left, that that dimension has been ignored or underestimated, and by just focusing on the violence of Hamas. Because there is a question here that we need to put on the table in terms of the false equivalence between the oppressor, the colonizer, and the oppressed and the colonizer. And the colonized, I'm sorry.
Mhm.
There is a kind of an equation between the violence of the two, the violence of the oppressor, which is infinitely much larger at various scales, and the revolutionary violence of the oppressed and the colonized, trying to recover their dignity, trying to liberate themselves, trying to get their human rights, right? We
Mhm.
cannot equate these two. So this is one lesson.
If I may, it's actually worse than that, because in the Western discourse, we the mainstream categorizes the violence of the oppressed as being worse, not the same, as being much worse than that of the oppressor, even though by any rational objective measure, you look at casualties, you look at destruction of civilian infrastructure, you look at the people who've been displaced, the children who have been orphaned, by any rational objective measure, the violence of the oppressor in Palestine is infinitely worse.
Yeah.
So they're not even generous enough to put them on the same level. The advocates for this regime. I'm sorry,
No, no,
that has
no.
to be said, because it's so perverse. It's so
Yeah.
offensive,
Yeah.
to people of conscience, that it has to
No,
be highlighted.
because in all the struggles, the anti-colonial struggle, either Vietnam, Algeria, or the Palestinian right now, um, there is this rejection and delegitimization of the violence of the oppressed and colonized. It's always reduced in some racist and orientalist cliches to, this timeless barbarism, irrational violence, and coming from those medieval and barbarian terrorists. That's what we get in the mainstream Western discourse. But that discourse evacuates a whole discussion on context, the context of decades or maybe more than a century of colonial violence,
Mhm.
massacres, occupation, apartheid, and the repeated killings and genocide that are taking place. So I think that point I wanted to really highlight it here,
Mhm.
because it is you find it in every struggle. Always the colonizer tries to delegitimize the others by saying these are barbarians, these are terrorists, these are subhumans, and we see exactly the same today with Palestinians. That's why, all the Israelis, political elites, media elites, military elites, their populations, just saying these are rats, these are subhumans, and they need to be exterminated. That's the language that we've seen in Algeria, in Vietnam, and we've seen in Palestine. But what I want to say, and I think this is very important, and that's what I've written in that chapter, is that the first chapter and the first episode of the Algerian uprising actually did not start in 1954. It started in 1945, 8th of May 1945. While the Europeans were celebrating the victory in Europe Day, were celebrating the capitulation of the Nazis, Algerians in Stif, specifically Stif, gathered asking for their own independence. They brandished many slogans, long free Algeria. They showed for the first time the Algerian flag, and so forth. So the French repressed in blood that gathering. And then that led to a rebellion by the Algerians, which ended up in the murder of around 103 European settlers, right? And you can imagine the level of vengeance and the retaliation, violent retaliation coming from the French. Maybe the listeners do not know, And I think they should know. You know what happened? Just in 2 months, following 8th of May, 1945, the Algerian, the French Navy, ground troops, the air forces, bombed various parts of those regions with napalm. They razed hundreds of villages, burnt and razed them. And with the vengeful settlers, the troops, the gendarmerie, and so forth, they killed around 45,000 people, Muslim people, just in 2 months, right? Just so for people to know that what we are seeing today is not just unique to Israel, is part of the colonial enterprise, is part of the European colonial enterprise that still persists till today. Because Israel should be seen as a Euro-American settler colony in the Arab region. It is an
100%. 100%. Thank you for saying that.
100%. It is an imperial advanced outpost to serve the interests, the geo-economic and geopolitical of US-led imperialism today. That's what Israel's functions there. So it's really important to say this. But let me come back to the 8th May 1945. That experience marked every Algerian alive at the time and convinced the Algerian nationalists and the Algerian militants that armed struggle is the way forward and preparations for it can no longer be postponed. Actually, every militant in the FLN, in the high ranks of the FLN, traces back their revolutionary determination to that moment, to 8th of May 1945. And I say that what happened since 7th of October, with the 7th of October attacks by Hamas and the Palestinian resistance and the genocide, the pitiless genocide that ensued, could constitute that moment for the future generations of Arab and Palestinian revolutionaries to trace back their revolutionary determination to that moment and to be inspired by the continuing resistance of the Palestinian people. Because if Israel think that they are winning, they have some victories here and there, in terms of maybe giving significant blows to the forces of resistance from Hezbollah to the Houthis to Iran to maybe even trying now to destroy Syria, they are wrong. They will never be safe because Arab populations and Arab revolutionaries won't allow this. It may be a short-lived win for them right now, but they will pay the price. I believe that the settler colonial state of Israel, the Zionist settler colonial project, will be dismantled. And I feel that this is the beginning of its end. Because ideologically, it is losing the battle. We are seeing that globally, as the global stage. And even the official positions of some Western powers are shifting. And this is a sign. Of course, they are not shifting in a material way, in a way that we want it yet. But the global opinion, the global majority are with Palestine and against that disease that is in the Middle East, that cancer that needs to be extirpated. There is no way of saying it. This is, a settler colonial project that has been dispossessing Palestinians from there, and it needs to end. It cannot live there because it's gonna create more insecurity, more unsafety for everyone, including Israeli people.
Yeah. I just want to interject. When you talked about this event in 1945, this it sounds like initially it was a peaceful protest by Algerians, which was met with terrible violence. The Algerian people reacted with violence, and then the full fury of the genocidal Western imperial mentality was visited upon the Algerian people, and 45,000 people were massacred in 2 months. Something very similar happened, although we don't talk about it much, in the case of the Palestinians, and that is the Great March of Return in Gaza happened in 2018, I think, or 2019. And for months, 1 month after another month, peaceful Palestinians walked up, people who have a right in international law to return to their homeland, walked up to the barrier that had been constructed by the Zionist entity to prevent them from exercising their right. They were carrying flags, they were unarmed, and one after one, they were shot dead. And they were disabled. And people who were killed included medics and journalists and disabled persons and women and children. And it went on for months, and the West did absolutely nothing about it. No one was held accountable. Israel continued to expand its settlements in the West Bank throughout this period. So the message to the Palestinian people, and particularly in Gaza at that point in time, was the only thing people understand is violence. We tried for months to exercise our rights peacefully, and they gunned us down mercilessly with no accountability whatsoever. I think this led, many other injustices led to October 7th, but this, I think, was a major contributing factor. And as in the case of Algeria, when the Palestinians in Gaza inflicted significant casualties on October 7th on the Israeli population, we've witnessed the most horrific, vengeful, satanic behavior on the part of the Zionist entity to send a lesson, to impose a lesson not only upon the Palestinians, but anybody in the region who may be tempted to resist, that the price for you will be inestimable. And there is no red line. And we will not only kill you, we will make you suffer in the process. It seems to me that there's a strong parallel between what has happened in the past several years in Gaza and what happened to the Algerian people in 1945.
Exactly. Exactly. So resistance, either peaceful or violent, is not allowed. You cannot resist oppression for them, at least for the colonial and imperialist, ruling classes and forces. You cannot resist either peaceful or violent, and the reaction is always disproportionate, always. And that happened in Algeria, that happened in Vietnam, and it is happening in Palestine. So that's why it's really important when we talk about violence and non-violence and armed struggle to not see this in a binary way. It's not just about using peaceful means against using violent means. Because as Mandela said clearly, given all his experience in violence and non-violent means, he said it's always the oppressor who determines the nature of the struggle and the nature of the tools that you use. And then sometimes it becomes very obvious to the nationalists or to the militant that the only way to go forward with your liberation is armed struggle. Because this is already set by the colonialists themselves. Palestinians have tried so many things: diplomacy, politics, peaceful marches, BDS, boycott and divestment and sanctions. It did not work. They tried violence as well. It has been defeated. So we cannot see them in a dichotomy. You just use that and that. These things, these tactics need to be, as I said earlier, need to be subordinated to a broader revolutionary political strategy that will have various tactics depending on the context, depending on the balance of the forces, and depending on what your enemy is doing. So, and here I'll come back to the differences that you mentioned. The current context, if we compare Algeria and Palestine, Palestine operates, at least the Palestinian struggle, operates in a much more hostile environment. Much more hostile, not amenable to progressive or revolutionary ideas. The era of anti-colonial struggles and third worldism is long gone. You look at the regional context, it's full of traitorous regimes that normalized with Israel, regimes that sold out the Palestinians, from Egypt to Jordan to the Gulf monarchies to Morocco to Sudan, and there are more maybe that will be coming along the way. So this does not help, and then you look at the world order. There are positives and negatives, but still, the US still is the dominating imperialist power, even if it is, weaning and going down slowly. But it is still, and it is back in Israel. So that context is not amenable. But there are opportunities. It's not all negative. It's not all black. We are seeing the amazing global solidarity that is coming from the global south. South Africa took Israel to the International Court of Justice. There are, warrants now against, Netanyahu, the war criminal Netanyahu, at the International Criminal Court. There are many countries in the South who cut ties with Israel. And a lot of us and organizations and trade unions are trying to push for more, cutting of trade ties in terms of providing energy, in terms of providing or buying Israeli products. So I think there is an inspiring wave that we are seeing right now, and this is gonna accelerate the move towards a multipolar order, and that's gonna weaken definitely the U.S. led empire. So that context has changed, and the Palestinians and the Palestinian anti-colonial forces, I feel they need to regroup. Of course, it's not up to me to say that, but just compared with the Algerian struggle, you need to have a unified front. A unified front with a clear political strategy that combine various tactics, and that would take into account the context at the national, regional, and international level. What is possible to do in various forums? Is the way forward armed struggle or no? This is up to the Palestinians to decide. What kind of tactics to be used? Who are your enemies? Who are your friends? And in this, the one disappointing thing for me is some powers that we expected to at least to get involved, like China and Russia, there is a kind of a reluctance and silence from them. I wished that China have taken a much more stronger position on this, but yeah, this is what it is.
In particular, and again, something we've talked about a lot on our program is both Russia and China. Although we resist very much the conventional narrative about Russia and China, there are many, many lies being perpetrated about their governments and so forth and their geopolitical objectives. But they could have sanctioned Israel. They could have imposed a complete cessation. I mean, it would have had zero impact on the Russian or the Chinese economies because they're so much larger than Israel's economy. But it would have had a significant impact. China, I think, is the second largest trading partner of Israel. And not only could they have done that, they have an obligation legally to do it pursuant to the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice in South Africa's genocide case. They have an obligation to do it under the Genocide Convention, Article 1. So certainly they could do much more. But they haven't. And one thing I want to say about the movement, again, this is another theme we try to stress in our program, is that I'm disappointed in the Palestinian solidarity movement in one respect, and there are exceptions, of course, but in general, what I'll call the mainstream Palestinian solidarity movement in the West is too hesitant to defend the Palestinians' right to armed resistance. They seem very concerned about being characterized as, supporters of terrorism, Hamas. But at the end of the day, this is a tool. This is a means, a tactic that is available to them as a lawful right. There is just as there would be if we were the ones who were being oppressed, if we persons of European origin, we would have a right to take up arms to liberate ourselves from oppression. And so too do the Palestinian people. And I think that we have to be more bold about stressing their right to armed resistance in the West and resisting this delegitimization of violence. Obviously, we don't condone, nor should we, acts of violence against civilians, but armed resistance to the oppressing military forces is entirely legitimate, and we shouldn't be shy about saying that. I'm curious.
And we're not saying anything outside of international law. Because if you go even to some of the UN conventions, and it says clearly that oppressed and colonized people have the right to use arms and to use armed struggle to liberate themselves. So we're not saying something new. And if we look at the history, that's how people liberated themselves. A lot of people liberated themselves through armed struggle. It's just a question for me to subordinate revolutionary violence and armed struggle to broader political goals. So that violence does not become, how can I say, chaotic, because it needs to be subordinated to a political program. And this is up to the Palestinian anti-colonial forces, to determine. Just, I wanted to come back a little bit, and then I'll come back, Dimitri, to what you said, because there are some other similarities as well that I forgot to mention. The use of food and famine as a weapon of war. That has been done by France in Vietnam. It has also been done by France in Algeria. Trying to destroy food production, trying to starve people. And, the military leaders, the military generals, they were saying it clearly. We need to starve the adversary. Clearly. Like this was, and Israel is just, continuing the same legacy and the same colonial history, is not doing anything new. Maybe it is escalating it in much more sophisticated ways, because there are much more sophisticated ways of doing it right now. But it's exactly doing what the other previous colonial powers have done. The other important point that I really want to emphasize is that, like France in Vietnam in the 50s, with the support of the United States, was trying to hold the imperial line in Vietnam. Because for them, if they lose Vietnam, they may lose other colonies in Africa. And actually, there are some quotes from, generals as well, saying, we are holding the imperial line here. It's really important that we win here. Palestine today is where Israel and the United States are holding the imperial line to safeguard their power, their geopolitical and economic dominance and interest. And for us as anti-colonialists and anti-imperialists, we need to center that struggle in our strategies, in our work, in our thinking, because if we hit imperialism in the Middle East, we hit it everywhere. And this is like a paraphrasing of one of the quotations by Ghassan Kanafani, one of the Palestinian left-wing revolutionaries and intellectuals. But to come back, just maybe you can edit this and put it in the other question, and then come back to your question now in terms of the main Western discourse, including in the left, trying to, delegitimize the use of violence and armed struggle. We need just to say more and more and more. Palestinians have the right to resist with any means necessary. And it is the oppressor and the colonized who determine the nature of the struggle. Palestinians have tried many, many things, including non-violent tactics, diplomacy, politics. The Palestinian Authority now has just surrendered after the Oslo Accords. It has become a kind of subcontractor to the Israeli occupation and apartheid regime. What do you want Palestinians to do? To give up, to die? No. We can, and in here, I remember the words of Walter Rodney. Walter Rodney said it clearly, and I think maybe shall I read that quote from Walter Rodney?
Please.
No. I think it's really an important one. Just one second. I found it.
Okay.
So Walter Rodney, specifically on the question of the use of violence by the oppressed and colonized, or maybe the slaves. So he said, we were told that violence in itself is evil, and that whatever the cause, it is unjustified morally. And then he adds, by what standard of morality can the violence used by a slave to break his chains be considered the same as the violence of a slave master? By what standards can we equate the violence of blacks who have been oppressed, suppressed, depressed, and repressed for 4 centuries with the violence of white fascists? Violence aimed at the recovery of human dignity and at equality cannot be judged by the same yardstick as violence aimed at maintenance of discrimination and oppression. End of quote. The same thing applies to Palestinians and other colonized and oppressed people all over the world. And I think this is not just a moral position, this is a political position. It is up to the oppressed to decide how their struggle is shaped. And I can guarantee you 100% that the oppressed won't be barbaric and terrorist and just use violence. They will always start with non-violent means. That's the history. You always start with non-violent means. You start by diplomacy. You start by compromising, trying to get your rights. And then when you see the intransigence, when you see the repression and the suppression from the other side, you're not left with no other recourse than to use armed struggle and revolutionary violence.
Well said, Hamza. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I hope we can continue this conversation. And as I indicated before we started, I would really enjoy the opportunity to interview you in French for the benefit of the Francophones in our audience at some later date. But for the time being, thank you very much. And we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you for having me. And I'm sure Palestine will be free.
Hear, hear. Inshallah. And this is Dimitri Lascaris signing off from Montreal, Canada on July 7th, 2025.